Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today on Tuesday, October the 3rd. Glad that you were able to take some time out of your schedule to join us for this third session on Universal Design for Learning. Some of you may have had the opportunity to join us on the first two. We focused on the other two networks of Universal Design for Learning and the networks of the brain. So today we're going to finish things off with a quick review, and then we'll go straight into session 3, the strategic network. Today, some of the goals that we'll be focusing on are what is actually meant by UDL. Some of you may be very familiar with UDL, and some of you may say, oh no, not another acronym. What does that stand for? So we'll be discussing that. We'll also hopefully increase your knowledge and understanding of some of the key vocabulary and principles of UDL. And then we'll also, because we're focusing on the strategic network, identify methods of differentiating ways students can express what they learn. This is probably my second favorite of the networks, first being engagement. If you've joined us in the others, you know that to me, engagement is definitely the most important, in my opinion, and just because I think once we figure out how to get our students engaged, then the rest of it kind of comes with it and is a little bit easier to address. Several years ago, I think CAST, you'll hear me speak about CAST several times. It's the Center for Applied Special Technologies. CAST is located outside of Boston, Massachusetts. It's a research facility that houses some of, in my opinion, some of the most intellectual researchers we have in the area of education, focusing on Universal Design for Learning and how students are learning and which way we need to go to increase that learning. So back in the early 80s, some researchers were together and they were looking at what had become a bell curve in education, with education focusing on just the middle student, the ones that fit in that. And so on the left and the right side of that bell, they realized that those students were totally missing out and that something had to change. And we needed to figure out a way to look at how we were teaching and how students were learning and come up with a plan in a way that we could address those specific students and include them all. So when you think of UDL, some of you, like I said, that are familiar with it, know that or think or hear that UDL is just good teaching, which it definitely has a component of good teaching. You can't do much without good teachers. UDL is differentiated instruction. Differentiated instruction is definitely an element of Universal Design for Learning, but it's not equitable if you've had them side by side. There are similarities, but they're built on two different bodies of research, and so that's what separates them. So Universal Design for Learning is an approach to designing instructional methods and materials that are flexible enough from the outset to adapt and allow for learner differences. This is a book published by Meyer and Rose. David Rose was one of the founding fathers, as I like to call him, of Universal Design for Learning, and helped coin the term and direct the research. He recently retired, but he is still definitely out there sharing his infinite wisdom and knowledge with others, and it is quite a unique and wonderful person to meet if you ever have the chance to talk with him. So back, I mentioned back in the 80s, these researchers were sitting around trying to figure out how to, quote unquote, fix education, knew there was a problem, and so they built upon what the ADA Act had initiated as far as Americans with Disabilities Act had provided for in our environment. If you think back to your daily activities and things that you do, you know that curb cuts, those little pieces of kind of like a ramp on our sidewalks are available there. We like to use those when we have a bicycle or if we have a stroller or if we're pulling carts, things like that. But they were originally designed with the intention of making it accessible for those in wheelchairs. So, definitely it's designed for them, but many of us benefit even though we're not in a wheelchair. Some other things that were designed with individuals with disabilities in mind are the ramps that go up to the front of the building, and sometimes we'll see those as being added on at the end, and sometimes we see those as being kind of developed and designed architecturally. And so we'll kind of talk about universal design being more proactive planning for those issues, the barriers that come along, but being flexible enough to adapt and allow for learning differences, whereas when we retrofit, we're going back and fixing things. When we talk about universal, we are talking about everyone, not just individuals in wheelchairs, not just individuals with disabilities, but all students and everyone that we are working with. UDL could definitely be broadened into an environmental setting, just like universal design originally was. But for the focus today, we'll strictly be talking about universal design for learning in an educational setting. When instruction is designed with all learners' needs in mind, anticipating barriers and facilitators of learning, we are definitely focusing on all students, not just individual ones. So these students may have difficulty understanding the text at grade level or understanding the language to the students who may have physical demands that need attending. When we as educators plan our instruction, the focus should be on student strengths, abilities, and learning preference, which will assist in increasing student engagement in their classroom, making their learning universal and accessible to everyone. See how that engagement piece kind of blends right in? And when we have them engaged, we've got the other parts. So UDL is a framework. It's designed to be somewhat of a guideline for educators to use when designing their lessons. We often like to say that we are not fixing the student, but we are fixing the curriculum, or we are adjusting the curriculum, not adjusting the students. So when we talk about the UDL guidelines, they're not meant to be what we would say a prescription, but maybe a set of strategies that can be employed to overcome the barriers that are inherent in most existing curricula. Oftentimes we do refer to specific educational methods as a prescription, but this is definitely not one of those. We're looking for opportunities that we can maximize learning for all students. Okay, a few minutes ago I talked about universal design for learning and its roots being founded in universal design in our environment. So these are some examples of being retro-fitted or being proactive in designing. If you look in the top left-hand corner, you see that those individuals are trying to carry that stroller up the steps, and how much easier it would be if there was a ramp there available for them. But not just that stroller, what if an individual in a wheelchair came up, or even on crutches and they weren't able to use that. So we plan things predicting some of those things. If you look at the automatic doors, I know that we all love to use those automatic doors whether we need them or not. And again, the escalator compared to the stairs. We definitely often choose those over the steps because it's more convenient and we like it more. And really and truly, when it comes down to it, it benefits us, but is designed for other people. And that's what we're looking at when we talk about designing our lessons for all students and being proactive, determining what we think those students have traditionally come with, understanding the backgrounds that they're coming to school with, and trying to plan ahead to meet all of their needs. So UDL draws upon and extends educational approaches with which many educators are already familiar with. It's nothing new, it's just emphasizing some things, such as teachers as guides or facilitators, learning as a process, and then construction of knowledge with active rather than passive engagement. So the goal of UDL is to, like we've said, eliminate those unnecessary barriers to learning without eliminating challenges in order to ensure all learners achieve standards. We're not watering down the curriculum. We're just making sure that we're eliminating those barriers by designing our lessons proactively. We're still maintaining high expectations for all of our learners, ensuring access to academic standards for all learners, and ensuring student interaction and engagement with content for all learners. So what are the benefits? Once again, we're proactively determining what's going to be our barriers our students come with, increase the effectiveness and the efficiency of instructional planning, provide options for everyone, engaging and supporting all students, and increasing the effectiveness of instruction, reducing the need for remediation and intervention. Because remember, we're planning ahead, so we don't have to go back and do any retrofitting. Here's a short video by David Rose that I mentioned earlier. Is what I like to say is the grandfather of UDL. And he is, like I said, since retired, but he is definitely out there sharing his infinite wisdom. So I'm going to share a bit with you now.
In many classrooms, the focus is on an illusory average student. Many curricula are designed for that student. Cognitive neuroscience has shown us that there really isn't an average student anywhere, and that's why it's an illusory student. Universal Design for Learning, though, is particularly focused on making sure that we get those students who have been marginalized, for whom that designing for the average student has never worked well. And that certainly means students who have been struggling, students for whom English is not their first language, students with disabilities. They've been typically marginalized by this illusory average curriculum. Secondly, though, students at the other margins, the students who are called gifted and talented, are also students who've been underserved by this mainstream curriculum. They haven't been challenged. They're bored. They're underserved as well. UDL is a framework based in cognitive neurosciences for designing learning experiences that work across a wide spectrum of learners. Its main purpose is to make sure that everybody is a successful learner and reaches what we call being an expert learner. That is, they know a lot, they know how to do a lot, and they love learning and want to do it more. The key to Universal Design for Learning is that we're designing learning experiences which from the beginning are designed to be universal and to make sure everybody learns. And that design is primarily based on the power to be very flexible in allowing choices, in allowing different paths, in allowing for things to be presented in different ways so that we reach those other two things, universal and everybody learns. The three principles of Universal Design for Learning come from careful analysis of what learning really is, and particularly the research that has been done by thousands of other researchers in cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, neuropsychology, which have carefully looked at what comprises learning, how does learning really work, and what are its differences among individual learners. From that work, we've abstracted out three simple principles that are involved in any learning situation. How does the learner pick up information? How do they express and act on that information? and how are they engaged by the learning situation. There are three broad principles. The first has to do with how we present information to the learner. And we talk about multiple means of representation. As it turns out, there's no one way that we can present information so to be successful for everyone to learn it. So we talk about multiple means of representation. So in UDL, we talk about providing multiple representations so that we're sure everyone will be able to make sense of the symbols, the language, the drawings, and so on. Take, for example, in teaching mathematics, it's typically very strong to use multiple representations, not just the symbolic expression of the numbers, but manipulables, things that the children can operate on and see directly and perceptually rather than their symbolic form. So that's a great example of providing multiple representation, both the symbolic number and a physical manipulative. The second principle is provide multiple means of action and expression. And that takes into account the fact that students vary greatly in how they express what they know, how they can act skillfully, how they can communicate in language or in drawing and so on. And students differ widely, so we say we must provide multiple means of expression over the course of our teaching and learning. The third principle is multiple means of engagement. And in many ways, it's the most important principle. If we don't engage students in learning, don't make it important to them, make them motivated for it, then none of the other forms of representation or expression will be that important. Within Universal Design for Learning, when we look at a curriculum, we think of four main components, and each of them need to be universally designed. The first component is, what are its goals? How do we translate standards into things that are important to do in the classroom? Secondly, what are the materials that are going to be in that classroom? Everything from a chalkboard to a textbook to a workbook to something on the wall. Are these materials key to learning? And if so, are they universally designed for learning? Third, the methods. How does the teacher go about teaching when she or he is working at helping students learn? Does she set up collaborative groups? Does she lecture? Does she provide experiences out in the world? And lastly, and very important to Universal Design for Learning, is the means of assessment. How are we sure that learning really occurs? When we began our work, we, like most people, were focused on learners who were doing poorly, who looked like they had disabilities. Over time, we began to change our focus because we could see when we were in classrooms that the classrooms were in fact disabling, that they were not designed properly to ensure that every child would succeed. And we began more and more to see that the curriculum itself was disabled, and that the work of the Universal Design for Learning guidelines is to reduce the disabilities in the curriculum itself so that more students succeed, more students have optimum challenges, and come out as expert learners in the end.
Okay, so I hope that through that video, you were able to gain some insight into the direction we're headed today from Dr. David Rose, and know that he, of course, addressed all three of the primary learning networks. And today, we're on our third one, finishing it up with the strategic network, the how of learning. How is it that the students are going to express what they've learned by providing multiple and flexible means of expressing that and offering alternatives for demonstrating what it is that they know. When you look at this chart in all three of the networks, it represents visually the connection that the different principles make in the brain, which helps the educator and student better create pathways of learning at the most basic level in the brain's neural networks. So when we talk about the how of learning, we're looking some of you that have been with us know that we focused on 3 different portions of the actual brain. And this is the last part. The part that's shown in blue is the how of learning for action and expression, and for strategic, goal-directed learners. Differentiate the ways that students express what they know and how they demonstrate that. It's how we gather facts and then how we characterize them based on what we hear, see, and read. It's how we are identified in letters or words or an author style are all part of this. Moving on to the actual guidelines that you heard Dr. Rose talk about, know that these guidelines shouldn't just be applied to one aspect of the curriculum, nor should they be used with only a few students. This is designed for universal for all students, if you recall, and ideally they would be used to evaluate and plan goals, methods, materials, and assessments for the purpose of creating a fully accessible learning environment for all students. We know that learners differ in the ways that they perceive and comprehend information that's presented to them. For example, those with sensory disabilities, such as blindness or deafness, learning disabilities, such as dyslexia, language or cultural differences, and so forth, may all require different ways of approaching content. Others may simply grasp information quicker or more efficiently through visual or auditory means rather than printed text. Also, learning and transfer learning occurs when multiple representations are used because it allows students to make connections within as well as between the concepts. In short, there is not one means of representation that will be optimal for all learners. Providing options for representation is essential. So we're kind of going to go through these checkpoints of the guideline, and I have some suggestions for you to use when trying to focus in on this specific part of learning. So the first one we're going to talk about is provide options for physical action. A textbook or workbook in a print format provides limited means of navigation or physical interaction, such as turning the pages, handwriting in spaces provided. Many interactive pieces of educational software similarly provide only limited means of navigation or interaction, such as using a joystick or a keyboard. Navigation and interaction in those limited ways will raise barriers for some learners. Those with physical disabilities, blindness, dysgraphia, or who need various kinds of executive functioning support. It's important to provide materials with which all learners can interact. Properly designed curriculum materials provide a seamless interface with common assistive technologies through which individuals with movement impairments can navigate and express what they know. To allow navigation or interaction with a single switch through voice-activated switches, expanded keyboards, and others. So the checkpoint here is vary the methods of response and navigation. So if we're providing alternatives in the requirements for rate, timing, speed, and range of motor action required to interact with instructional materials, physical manipulatives, and technologies. So we know that as educators, we've often used different types of manipulatives because we know that that physical manipulation is a way that we can get students engaged and interacting with the knowledge, provide alternatives for physically responding or indicating selections, such as alternatives to marking with pen and pencil, alternatives to mouse control. This is where we get into some specialized AT for some of our students that might use it because they need it or use it because they benefit from it, and provide alternatives for physically interacting with materials by hand, voice, single switch, joystick, keyboard, or adapted keyboard. The next one is optimize access to tools and assistive technologies. So sometimes providing a tool for a student is not enough. We need to provide the support to use the tool effectively. Many learners need help navigating through the environment, both in terms of physical space and the curriculum. And all learners should be given the opportunity to use tools that might help them meet the goal of full participation in the classroom. However, significant numbers of learners with disabilities have to use assistive technology for navigation, interaction, and composition on a regular basis. It is critical that instructional technologies and curricula do not impose inadvertent barriers to the use of these assistive technologies. An important design consideration, for example, is to ensure that there are keyboard commands for any mouse action so that learners can use common assistive technologies that depend upon those commands. It's important, however, to ensure that making a lesson physically accessible does not inadvertently remove its challenge to the learning. There's a lot in that short statement that I just made about when we provide tools for our students, but then we don't provide the support. We know that we have to carry through with that. We can't just give them something and expect them to figure out how to use it and how to use it to access the curriculum. So some suggestions here is to use text equivalents in the form of captions or automated speech-to-text, voice recognition type software for spoken language. This is something that I bet you don't even realize that you're using on a daily basis, most of us. But if you have a smartphone and you are giving it voice commands, basically, or when we actually, like if we are sending a text and we do the voice, basically it's speech-to-text. It's doing it for us. And we know, I know that's one I like to use when I'm driving. And I don't think we ever realize that that's really all it is a speech-to-text. Another suggestion would be to provide visual diagrams, charts, notations of music or sound. When we watch, a lot of times if you're using a website, you'll notice that they've got some of those little notations there. Provide American Sign Language for spoken English, which is a common one that we see for our students who are deaf and hard of hearing. Use visual analogs to represent emphasis and prosody, such as emoticons, symbols, or images. Now, I know that every single one of us that have smartphones, even those of you who still have the old school phones, are using emoticons or some type of symbol or even some of those new images that they've put in our text area. And we don't even think about that being something that would, but yet it conveys really what we're trying to say when strictly words sometimes don't. Another suggestion is to provide visual or tactile equivalents for sound effects or alerts. A suggestion here is vibrations. We can go right back to our smartphones or cell phones, and when we like to turn the ringer off, we use that tactile type feedback for the sound effect. Some of us also turn on the flash so that it flashes, which is actually designed for the visually impaired, but is to me a great feature that I know that my phone's ringing or I'm receiving a message when I see that flashing light and or hear it vibrating. Those of you that have a smartwatch, like an Apple Watch, we're doing the same thing. We're turning the sound off, but we're using those different types of vibrations. And usually mine are very different. I can tell when I'm getting an email versus a different vibration for a text message and then another one for a call. And we're all using those on a daily basis. Another thing we could do is provide visual and or emotional description for musical interpretation. Okay, so the next guideline shows provide options for expression in the communication. There's no medium of expression that is equally suited for all learners or for all kinds of communication. On the contrary, There are media which seem poorly suited for some kinds of expression and for some kinds of learning. So I'm going to pause and go right back to the smartphone. When we just strictly type something in text, often it can be misunderstood or misinterpreted. That's not a great use of expression, but when we add those images or those emoticons, it helps us convey that expression. While a learner with dyslexia may excel at storytelling and conversation, he may falter when telling the same story in writing. It's important to provide alternative modalities for expression, both to the playing field among learners, and to allow their learner to appropriately express knowledge, ideas, and concepts in the learning environment. Okay, I'm going to go back and highlight a section there that I just said about level the playing field among learners. So often when we're in the classroom, and even us as educators, I hear, well, if I provide it for him, well, I have to provide it for all. No, you don't have to. We're just trying to equal the playing field for the student, get him up to par with the others. But it's definitely, there's no issues with sharing some of that information. I was recently in a meeting and we were coming up with some supports for a 4th grade student with a hearing impairment. And one of the suggestions was record the teacher's lectures. And the teacher said, well, what if the other students want that? That's fabulous. Let them have it. Share that resource with them. It's a tool that they may benefit from. One student may need it, and it's going to level the playing field for him. But for the other students, if they can benefit from it, then by all means, share that information with them. Same for having a peer take notes. If someone's taking notes, then share the notes with the rest of the class. So if they can use them, great. If not, then the student that needs it has it. We can use multiple media for communication. Unless specific media materials are critical to the goal, learning to paint specifically with oils, learning to handwrite with calligraphy, it's important to provide alternative media for expression. Such alternatives reduce media-specific barriers to expression among learners with a variety of special needs, but also increases the opportunities for all learners to develop a wider range of expression in a media-rich world. For example, it's important for all learners to learn composition, not just writing, and to learn the optimal medium for any particular content of expression and audience. So when we're talking about multiple media for communication and having the students use specific media materials at times, it's important that we as educators focus in on what our goal is. Is our goal to use multiple tools there, or is it to simply paint a picture? Is it to paint with oils? If so, then use the oils, but let them maybe paint whatever pictures they'd like. If the picture is supposed to be a still picture, then let them use a variety of media. That's more of a higher level of suggestion, obviously, but you can definitely relate it back to our younger students too. One of the examples I like to use is in elementary school. If we are having students read a specific chapter book and then write a report, well, what is my actual goal that I'm trying to focus on? What is the standard that I'm focusing on? Is it to read a chapter book, or is it to write a book report? Well, if it's to read a chapter book, then have them choose any chapter book that might be engaging to them, and then they can write the book report. If it's to write a book report and you want those specific skills, to let them kind of come out with a variety of ways of which they could, quote unquote, share what they have learned from that book, their comprehension. Some other ideas are to compose in multiple media such as text, speech, drawing, illustration, design, film, music, dance movement, visual art, sculpture, or video. We know that our students love to interact and to kind of build little skits sometimes. If so, if the book report is really just for them to demonstrate their knowledge of the book, then have them act it out. Have them draw a poster or a comic strip. Use a simple filmmaking tool on the computer and let them make a quick video. Use physical manipulatives such as blocks or models. Use social media and interactive web tools such as discussion forums, chats, annotation tools, storyboards, comic strips, and so forth. Compose in multiple media such as text, speech, drawing, illustration, and comics, and then use different strategies for solving some of those. The next checkpoint is using multiple tools for construction and comprehension. And so when we focus in on this one, there's a tendency to focus on traditional tools rather than contemporary ones. This tendency has several liabilities. It does not prepare learners for their future. It limits the range of content and teaching methods that can be implemented, and it restricts learners' ability to express knowledge about content, their assessment. And most importantly, it constricts the kinds of learners who can be successful. Current media tools provide a more flexible and accessible toolkit with which learners can more successfully take part in their learning and articulate what they know. Unless a lesson is focused on learning to use a specific tool, curricula should allow many alternatives. Just like craftsmen, learners should learn to use tools that are an optimal match between their abilities and demands for the task. Some strategies and tools that we can use to support this is providing spell checkers, grammar checkers, word prediction software, text-to-speech software, so voice recognition, human dictation, a recording, providing a variety of calculators. In the early grades, sentence starters or sentence strips, and then some concept mapping tools. And those can start, of course, the younger age and go into the higher grades. The next one is build fluencies with graduated levels of support for practice and performance. We know that, especially in today's world, learners must develop a variety of fluencies in visual, audio, mathematical, reading, etc. This means that they often need multiple scaffolds to assist them as they practice and develop independence. Curricula should offer alternatives in the degrees of freedom available, with highly scaffolded and supported opportunities provided for some and wide degrees of freedom for others who are ready for independence. Fluency is also built through many opportunities for performance, be it in the form of an essay or a dramatic production. Performance helps learners because it allows them to synthesize their learning in personally relevant ways. Overall, it's important to provide options that build learners' fluencies. Again, this goes back to the book report idea of determining what it is that we want the students to be able to do and providing them opportunities to share that information in a variety of ways. The next guideline is provide option for executive function. Executive function definitely seems to be a new buzzword or buzzwords in education these days, but it cannot be assumed that learners will set appropriate goals to guide their work, but the answer should not be to provide goals for students. Such a short-term remedy does little to develop new skills or strategies in any learner. It is therefore important that learners develop the skill of effective goal setting. The UDL framework embeds graduated scaffolds for learning to set personal goals that are both challenging and realistic. Some suggestions here for strategies would be to provide prompts and scaffolds to estimate effort, resources, and difficulty, provide models or examples of the process and product of goal setting, provide guides and checklists for scaffolding goal setting, post goals, objectives, and schedules in an obvious place. This is one, and you'll probably laugh and think about some of your colleagues that may have missed out on some of the executive functioning modeling. But we know that, first of all, as an educator, we know that modeling is one of the best methods of teaching something, so that when we can show them how to set those goals and how to make them accessible, then we're going to guide our students. The next checkpoint is support planning and strategy development. Once a goal is set, effective learners and problem solvers plan a strategy, including the tools they will use. For reaching that goal, for young children in any domain, older learners in a new domain, or any learner with one of the disabilities that compromise executive functioning, such as intellectual disabilities, a strategic planning step is often omitted, and trial and error attempts take its place. To help learners become more planful and strategic, a variety of options are needed, such as cognitive speed bumps that prompt them to stop and think, graduated scaffolds that help them actually implement strategies, or engagement in decision-making with competent mentors. So some suggestions for strategies here would be embed some prompts to stop and think before acting, as well as adequate space. Prompts to show and explain your work. This would be good for portfolio reviews. Provide checklists and project planning templates for understanding the problem, setting up prioritization, sequences, and schedules of steps. And again, this is not something we're just automatically born with. This is something that has to be taught. I think we all kind of figure out our own system, but ultimately it starts with being taught how to do these things. Facilitate managing information and resources. One of the limits of executive function is that imposed by the limitations of so-called working memory, the scratch pad for maintaining chunks of information where they can be accessed as part of comprehension and problem solving is very limited for any learner, and even more severely limited for many learners with learning and cognitive disabilities. As a result, many such learners seem disorganized, forgetful, and unprepared. I know you're thinking of some of your students, maybe some of your children or colleagues. Wherever working memory capacity is not construct relevant in a lesson, it's important to provide a variety of internal scaffolds and external organizational aids, exactly those kinds that executives use, to keep information organized and in mind. I know we all use various tactics. I use my smartphone I have multiple lists of reminders. I also keep my calendar in a digital format, and I'm trying to learn to have it in a print format too, so that I can see the big picture. But we all come up with our own ways, own strategies, but we have to understand the purpose of them and the intent by someone who's teaching us those things. So providing checklists and guides for note-taking, just providing those templates that kind of walk them through the process. And the last one in this section is enhanced capacity for monitoring progress. Learning cannot happen without feedback, and that means learners need a clear picture of the progress they are or are not making. When assessments and feedback do not inform instruction, or when they are not given to the students in a timely manner, learning cannot change because students do not know what to do differently. This lack of knowledge about what to improve can make some learners seem perseverative, careless, or unmotivated. For these learners, all of the time, and for most learners, some of the time, it's important to ensure that options can be customized to provide feedback that is more explicit, timely, informative, and accessible. Especially important is providing formative feedback that allows learners to monitor their own progress effectively and to use that information to guide their own effort and practice. I feel like that formative feedback part is something that we've all known, we've all used and provided in the classroom, but it seems to be coming more on the surface as a new buzzword when really it's definitely not new, but just a reminder of constantly providing that formative feedback to monitor students' progress and to teach them to monitor their own progress. So some things we can do is, again, use of assessment checklists, scoring rubrics, provide differentiated models of self-assessment strategies such as role-playing, video reviews, peer feedback, and prompt learners to identify the type of advice or feedback that they're seeking. Sometimes we offer something and it's not exactly what they need, and they need to be able to verbalize what it is that they actually need. Okay, so this next video is only 3 minutes, and then we've got a couple of slides to finish off the day for us.
The UDL guidelines at heart are meant to address a very significant problem in American education, which is that we've had a very fixed and narrow curriculum designed for some students, but not all students. And we then have labeled or described the students for whom it doesn't work as having disabilities or having weaknesses or struggling learners or something. We now think of curricula and schools and learning environments as having their own disabilities. And the point of the Universal Design for Learning guidelines is to redress, to try to reduce those disabilities. And by doing so, fewer kids will be called disabled and more students will be successful.
How about this one? Is there any fat? No. And how about that one? No. Okay, so let's go on to another one. I use the UDL framework when I design my lessons to give me a guideline so I can be clear of what my barriers are. When I'm looking at a lesson or I'm looking at the materials I'm using for planning a lesson, I try and identify what's going to be a barrier for certain students. I have a lot of different students and there's a great diversity of learners in my room, so I have to be very careful about how I plan out my lessons. I have to plan and design how I'm going to help them go over those barriers. Today's methods are hands-on, interactive, engaging. So hopefully by doing that and having them actually doing something, instead of reading about sugar molecules, we're going to demonstrate it in a different way.
I think supporting UDL in any school is going to take a little courage, that one needs to team with your teachers in a way that you're able to trust the teachers who are open to making sure that they're able to accomplish their goals, and be very, very creative in a constant and ongoing way as to how we reach every student. Administrators need to validate the hard work that goes into that. I think they need to cheerlead in some time. I think they need to also make sure that the work we're doing is accountable, make sure that the assessments are there, and that UDL is good for everyone. UDL is not for specific types of students, so that each of us, every single one of us, is able to get what we need and make sure that we feel that thrill of knowing that we've accomplished something and that learning is exciting.
In the end, what I find is that the students are on the same page, and it's really rewarding to me to have students who are non-readers participating in a conversation with my top level students and have that interaction going on in class. And that's when I know I've done something right. When everybody can communicate with each other and participate in a class, that's when we've got it right. And that makes putting the extra time in worthwhile.
Okay, so hopefully that kind of reiterated some of the things that we've discussed in this most recent session. And so moving on, we talk about UDL and technology. Oftentimes I hear teachers say they quote unquote can't afford technology and UDL. UDL is not technology based. It can definitely help enhance it, but that's not the only way. Educators who don't have access to the latest can definitely apply UDL in powerful ways. I like to say it's not the tools that you use, it's how you use the tools that make it more universally designed. UDL is just a new way of thinking. Our work taught us that when education fails, barriers to learning are likely found in the curriculum, not in individual learners who follow along a long continuum of diverse abilities, interests, and skills. As a result, the burden to adapt must, as a first step, be placed where it belongs, on the curriculum itself. And this just reminds you that we're not going to fix the students. We're going to fix the curriculum and make sure that we're meeting the needs of all students. So, as we finish up, I've realized about halfway through the session that I never introduced myself, and I apologize. That's what happens, I guess, when this is the third session in a three-part series, is I think I've already done it. Here's my contact information. I am Judy Peacock. I work as an assistive technology specialist in a school district in Florida, and I have worked with assistive technology, instructional technology, and of course UDL for about 14 years now. So here, definitely if you have any questions, feel free to email me. If you have any right now, feel free to post them in the question box, and I can answer those. The resource information that I used today is all from cast.org. Like I said, Center for Applied Special Technologies, and that will link you to the udlcenter.org. They're both work together, so you'll find information on both of those sites. Again, thank you for taking an hour out of your afternoon today to hang out with me and learn a little bit more about the strategic network. For those of you who have been with us throughout all three sessions, I greatly appreciate it, and I hope that you are walking away with some information and some resources that you can definitely share and or use in your daily